Hello everybody, my name is Duncan Campbell and I'm an elected councillor with Taupo District Council. I'm also a practicing civil engineer specialising in transport, and I have been involved with council work nearly all of my working life, which is coming up to 30 years or so now. Now the thrust of my talk today is relevant to Taupo District Council in particular, and is quite probably relevant to many other councils out there as well. I'm suspecting more likely to be the smaller provincial ones, because there wasn't nearly such a thing in Auckland, where I have spent most of my working life. The topic: delegations, and financial delegations in particular. Layman's terms: who gets to sign off on major expenditure items, and not just the broad brush of annual or long-term plans where everything gets thrown in the basket all at once. I believe until the delegation settings are changed at Taupo District Council, so that elected members can get more direct oversight of individual large expenditures, only then can we have a sporting chance of reining in the rates emergency we are currently in and have been for some time. In fact, I can see no other possible way. So let's start with some history. I discovered that from November 2021, the Taupo Chief Executive's financial delegations did get elevated above the previous 500,000 threshold to effectively no limit, provided it was already line itemed in an annual or long-term plan. Although I'm not exactly sure of the process prior to that date, any individual items of expenditure had to individually be reported on and signed off by elected members, one at a time. In the staff report for that change of November 2021, the perceived reduction in councillor oversight was actually mentioned as a disadvantage. And from my own point of view, it is certainly much more than just perception. It is a solid reality, and large expenditure items do not get the scrutiny they properly deserve. Perhaps some of the old-hand elected members of 2021 will illuminate it to us at some point about why they felt they could so devolve themselves of responsible financial oversight, and I do look forward to any explanations. But I will not hold my breath about that happening. And by the way, at no other council I've ever worked in my own 30 years work career did financial authority ever get carte blanche handed over to staff as thoroughly as here at Taupo District Council. So why have more regular reporting of expenditure to elected members than just the 12-monthly annual or long-term plan? Because those events, as any newly elects will find out soon enough, are cram sessions where the whole of council expenditure, hundreds of line items, get glossed over at a very fast pace with little opportunity to scrutinise and ask these three important questions. And I'm mostly thinking of capital expenditure items or stuff that gets built, but they can relate to anything. Number one, do we really have to do it, and what happens if we don't? That should be a starting point for anybody buying anything, really. Number two, what are the benefits versus costs? Not much point doing something if it creates more problems than it solves. And thirdly, what are the alternatives, and can we do it cheaper? That is the question to ask once we have decided we want to do something. Now, none of these are questions that any financial accountant or auditor is likely able to answer. And if you think about it, these are exactly what anybody asks before making any significant purchase. So if we are serious about a back to basics approach, this is what it has to look like. Standoffish governance, as we currently practice at Taupo District Council, just isn't going to cut it anymore, as if it ever really did. especially in this rates-constrained environment, which is only going to get more difficult. We need to do more thinking outside of the square, and sometimes council staff are not in the best position to be able to do that. It also brings to mind that elected members should be able to more often get access to independent expert advice, which simply isn't the case right now. And I believe to make that happen, a separate budget needs to be set up and outside the Chief Executive's control. Okay, so let's briefly look at doing things cheaper. And I will dive into something I'm most familiar with because I've had a lot to do with them in my profession, roundabouts. We have on left the recent new roundabout built at Taharipa Road, AC Bars intersection, which cost 1.6 million, and it is a nice roundabout. However, in contrast, a few years ago I designed and got built these two roundabouts in West Auckland, shown centre, for less than around 300,000 each in today's dollars, one of them at a much busier location than anything in Taupo. Now, it wasn't that I managed to find a really competitive source of concrete and asphalt. No, it involved the application of first principles to achieve the main rump of benefits in the most economic and efficient way. In other words, good design. And not just grabbing some cookie-cutter solutions from a textbook. And with intersections, the quantifiable benefits to measure are road safety and driver delays. Now, of course, a small council like Taupo cannot expect to have the most qualified and experienced designers on staff for everything all of the time. And this I see as a real Achilles heel of any council procurement process, i.e., staff not being aware of what they don't know to be able to seek the advice they need to know. Now, I don't have a silver bullet solution to this particular problem because council in New Zealand are a far cry from what they used to be 30 or so years ago, with seasoned experience not being valued nearly as much as the management culture which has taken over. But elected members need to be taking more responsibility to check things out than they had to than in the days we had a trusted town engineer. And irrespective of the above, and just from a humanity point of view, doing stuff cheaper can make more work for staff because it can result in unspent budgets unless you find other ways to spend it. And that might even mean working in the weekend. Far less work and trouble to push out the cookie-cutter solutions, and also much less risk because if something does go wrong, then nobody can ever accuse you of doing something different. And the far right example on the screen is from Dunedin, which managed to do a dozen roundabouts for a grand total of just $155,000 not long ago. Arguably more of a number 8-wire solution, but effective all the same. And again, these are not something that any financial accountant or auditor will be able to help you with. And just one other roundabout example. On left, you have a typical rural roundabout, say quite similar in scale to the roundabout installed on Waireki Drive a year or two ago. The centre picture, we have a much more affordable, compact design from the state of Victoria in Australia, which uses raised speed platforms to keep vehicle speeds down rather than large geometry. We might have saved $1 million if we'd done the same. Okay, now about the paperwork. This was just a 3-page example I plucked out from my time on staff at Waitakere City Council back in the day before Super City Auckland came along. And it's a report to seek approval from a community board before we as staff could proceed with design and construction of a new roundabout. Pretty skimpy paperwork by today Auckland Transport standards, and the level of detail of this reporting is always subjective. But it gives elected members the opportunity to ask such pointed questions as, do we need a roundabout? And isn't there anything else we could do? Staff who don't have the answers simply won't be able to proceed. My rule of thumb as a staffer writing reports for approval would be to know your audience. And the elected members in this particular community board, which I was seeking approval, weren't exceedingly intellectual, but there was at least one cynic who always needed pleasing. For this project, there had already been some level of community engagement, which they were already aware of. And although this project would have been in the annual plan, it still had to get sign-off by a majority vote, and certainly before we did any detailed design or went to tender. Hence, the estimated cost at this early reporting stage was usually of a very rough order, but often within plus minus 30% or so. And yes, sometimes projects did get rejected and didn't get built, but that is just how things roll up there. Taupo District Council does not have this crucial step because in November 2021, the elected members at the time decided it wasn't necessary. Okay, second to last slide. If we were going to be getting more reporting, where would these need to come for approval? Now, as I said, we have three options. First, we could create a special financial committee, as many councils already have, and separate from any other responsibilities. Second, we could have them go to some of the existing committees, e.g. water projects to a water services committee. Or third, we could have it reporting to full council. Now, I personally think the first option of a separate financial committee has the much better chance of success because it will be able to focus on the three important questions of all time. Do we really have to do it? What are the benefits versus costs? And can we do it cheaper? Rather than getting watered down with all the other things going on. Now, I haven't done an extensive search of what happens at every other council in the country, but what I did find out on ChatGPT did bring forth a summary statement shown at bottom, which more or less aligns with the above. As a note, though, any spending thresholds we do set are bound to be fairly arbitrary by nature and therefore subject to staff manipulation. What I mean by that is, for example, breaking up a project into bite-sized chunks to avoid having to report upstairs. Now, that's been an obvious loophole since the beginning of time in my experience. It's just human nature. Final slide. Okay, here I have put on paper to see what thresholds of 500,000 and 1 million would have looked like for the 2025-26 financial year capital projects at Taupo District Council. Basically, if the threshold was 1 million, we would have required 10 reports, and if it were 500,000, just over twice that number, or on average just 2 reports every month. And realise that some of these projects would have been happening over more than just one financial year, so might not require the same scrutiny 12 months later if nothing much has changed. Having been there and done that many times before as a council staff member, I reckon that a couple of additional reports each month isn't too much to ask from staff in order to more properly justify how they are spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Not least that 60 million or so extra bridge for Taupo Township over the Waikato River, which was slipped into the last long-term plan without any scrutiny by elected members at all. So yes, this will add some stress to the system because it will introduce another hurdle to get over. But as stated before, it is normal practice in other places, and in the current rates emergency climate, it's the absolute least we can be doing to rein in the spending. Now, I have focused on capital works in this presentation, which I recognise does not have the same impact to rates that operational spend does. But I see no reason why the same scrutiny cannot be applied, and starting with the biggest burden of all, being staff salaries. I lied. There is one more slide, and a reminder of why this is so important to get right and make happen now. We need to rejig the financial delegations to force elected members to take more direct responsibility for the big expenditures and get this rates emergency under control. Thank you for your time.